You might want to watch who you're talking to, Captain. The words were calm, almost conversational, but they cut clean through the low murmur of the strategy room at Fort Ridgeline. Captain Lucas Grant didn't look up at first. He was too busy gesturing at the digital map projected across the 40-inch screen, a shifting display of ridgelines and supply routes measured in miles and elevation lines. Around the long oak table, a dozen officers sat rigid in pressed uniforms, their coffee cups resting on neatly stacked briefing packets. At the far end of the room stood Samuel Mercer, 72 years old, wearing a plain gray service polo with the base contractor logo stitched over his heart. He held a stainless steel carafe in one hand, steady despite the faint tremor in his fingers, and a tray of ceramic mugs in the other. To most of the room, he was invisible. Just the coffee server. Just the old guy who refilled cups before the real work began. "Sir, this is a restricted planning session," Grant said without turning around, his voice edged with impatience. "You can leave the tray and clear out." A few lieutenants exchanged faint smirks. Mercer stepped forward anyway, placing the tray down with deliberate care. The mugs made a soft porcelain click against the polished wood. His posture, though slightly stooped, carried an old precision. Heels aligned, shoulders squared, chin level. Corporal Nate Holloway, seated near the door, noticed it immediately. Contractors didn't stand like that. Grant finally turned, eyes scanning the older man with a quick, dismissive glance. "You serve coffee. That's all. We'll handle the northern approach." Mercer's pale blue eyes drifted toward the glowing map. The fluorescent lights reflected faintly off the surface, outlining a narrow valley and a ridge marked at 6,200 feet. He studied it the way a man studies weather rolling in across open plains. Outside the reinforced windows, late afternoon wind brushed across the motor pool, rattling a loose flag halyard against its pole in a slow, metallic rhythm. "Your northern flank is exposed," Mercer said quietly. The room paused, then released a short ripple of laughter. Grant exhaled through his nose. "Appreciate the concern," he replied dryly. "But this isn't a diner conversation." Mercer didn't react. He simply reached forward and adjusted a mug that had drifted too close to the edge of the table. The movement revealed a thin white scar circling his wrist, old and clean, like something earned decades ago. Holloway felt something tighten in his chest. There was no defensiveness in the old man's face, no attempt to prove himself. Just observation. Just certainty. The door at the rear of the room opened with a muted hydraulic hiss. Conversations snapped off mid-breath. General William Hayes entered without announcement, for silver stars resting steady on his shoulders, his presence altering the air the way a pressure shift announces a coming storm. Every officer rose in unison. Mercer stepped back instinctively, moving toward the wall with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to staying out of the spotlight. Hayes nodded once to the room, then let his gaze sweep the table. It passed over Grant, over the map, and then it stopped. The general's expression didn't change at first, not visibly, but something in his eyes sharpened, as if a distant frequency had suddenly come back online. He took one slow step forward, then another. The hum of the overhead lights seemed louder now, the air heavier, waiting. Hayes studied the old contractor's face for a long moment. "I haven't heard that kind of analysis in years," he said softly. His voice carried across the silent room with measured weight. "Not since Kuhner." Mercer didn't look away. He didn't stand taller. He didn't salute. He simply met the general's eyes, steady and unreadable. Somewhere near the back, someone swallowed hard. And for the first time that afternoon, Captain Lucas Grant realized he might not know the whole story. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, stretched tight across the room like wire pulled between two steel posts. General William Hayes stopped 3 feet from Samuel Mercer and studied him the way a man studies a landmark he never expected to see again. Captain Lucas Grant remained standing at attention, confusion hardening into something closer to unease. Hayes spoke again, his voice lower now, stripped of command tone and edged with memory. "What was your call sign back then?" The question was not for the room. It was not for the officers seated around the table. It was for one man. Mercer's hand rested lightly against the back of a chair. The faint tremor had steadied. He inhaled once, slow and measured, as if drawing in mountain air that had not touched his lungs in decades. "Ghost line," he said. He did not raise his voice. He did not embellish the words. He simply released them into the room. The effect was immediate and absolute. It was as if the air had been vacuumed from the space. A lieutenant near the projector felt his throat go dry. Corporal Nate Holloway's spine straightened without conscious thought. The name carried weight, the kind that did not need explanation. General Hayes closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them again. There was no doubt there now, only recognition. Operation Black Ridge, Hayes said quietly, almost to himself. 6,000 feet above sea level. 40-mile-per-hour crosswinds. Communications blackout. He turned slightly, addressing the officers who had been laughing minutes earlier. We had a narrow window for extraction. One voice kept the line clear. One voice kept the entire column from walking into disaster. He looked back at Mercer. That was you. Mercer's expression did not change. He did not nod. He did not confirm. His eyes held the same calm they had when he was pouring coffee. Hayes took one more step forward. Around the table, chairs creaked softly as officers adjusted their posture, unsure whether to remain rigid or at ease. Captain Grant's pulse thudded in his ears. The man he had dismissed was standing inches from the highest authority on base, and the general was speaking to him like a peer. You left without ceremony, Hayes continued. No retirement parade. No press. Just gone. Mercer's gaze drifted briefly to the digital map glowing behind Grant. Some lines are not meant to stay open forever, he said. The words landed heavier than any raised voice could have. Hayes drew himself upright, heels clicking together in a sharp, unmistakable motion. The sound echoed against the conference room walls. Every officer instinctively mirrored the movement. Then, in full view of the room, General William Hayes brought his hand to his brow in a precise, deliberate salute. It is an honor, sir. No one moved. No one spoke. Captain Lucas Grant felt heat rise in his face, not from reprimand, but from realization. He had walked past a man who once steadied an entire operation with nothing more than a radio and a calm voice. And now that same voice had returned, not to boast, not to correct, but simply to observe. The map on the screen still showed the exposed northern flank. No one laughed this time. No one lowered their hand until Samuel Mercer gave the smallest nod, the kind that would have gone unnoticed in any other room. General William Hayes dropped his salute with deliberate precision, and the officers followed half a heartbeat later. The sound of fabric shifting and heels settling against the floor seemed louder than it should have been. Captain Lucas Grant felt the weight of the moment press against his chest. He had spent months studying strategy, memorizing terrain data down to the foot and recalculating supply routes to the mile. Yet the man he dismissed had seen the flaw in less than 10 seconds. Hayes turned toward the digital map again. Walk us through it, he said, not as an order, but as an invitation. Mercer hesitated, eyes moving across the table as if searching for the right boundary. I am just here to pour coffee, he replied quietly. Hayes shook his head once. Not today. The general stepped aside, giving Mercer a clear line to the screen. For a moment, the old contractor simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides. Then he moved forward, not hurried, not hesitant. He picked up the laser pointer resting near the projector and aimed it at the ridge marked in red. Your primary route runs 12 miles along this valley, he began, voice steady and even. On paper, it looks protected, but at 6,000 feet, wind does not behave the way it does at ground level. It shifts through the cut here. He traced a small arc across the map. If you rely on satellite updates alone, you will miss the drift. The northern flank becomes visible from two positions you have marked as low risk. No one interrupted. No one smirked. Corporal Nate Holloway leaned forward, eyes locked on the glowing red as it moved across the screen. Grant felt heat in his ears again, but this time it was not embarrassment. It was focus. Mercer continued. Adjust your advance by 3 miles to the west. Stage your support here, behind the elevation break. It shortens your exposure window by nearly 40%. Hayes glanced at Grant. Is he correct? Grant swallowed once and ran the numbers quickly in his head. The math aligned. The oversight was small but critical. Yes, sir, he answered, voice tight. But steady. Hayes gave a single nod. Then we adjust. The projector hummed softly as the map recalibrated. The new line appeared in green. Mercer set the pointer down exactly where he had found it. There was no triumph in his posture, no expectation of praise. He stepped back toward the wall, reaching once more for the stainless steel carafe as if the last 5 minutes had not happened. Grant turned toward him fully now. "Sir," he said, the word deliberate and clear. Mercer paused. "Thank you." The older man studied him for a brief moment, eyes soft but unreadable. "Just keep the line open," he replied. Outside the window, the wind shifted again, brushing across the motor pool and carrying the faint snap of the flag against its pole. Inside the strategy room, no one would ever look at the coffee server the same way again. The meeting did not resume the way it had begun. The tension that once felt sharp and impatient had shifted into something steadier, almost reverent. Officers leaned over their notes with renewed focus, recalculating distances, adjusting timelines, speaking in measured tones instead of confident assumptions. General William Hayes remained at the head of the table, but his attention drifted more than once toward the back of the room, where Samuel Mercer stood beside the coffee station, quietly refilling cups that no one had touched in several minutes. Captain Lucas Grant cleared his throat and stepped away from the table. The movement drew a few glances, but no one stopped him. He walked toward Mercer with controlled steps, the kind drilled into him since basic training. When he reached him, he did not tower or posture. He stopped at a respectful distance. "I misjudged you," Grant said plainly. There was no sarcasm in his voice now. Mercer poured the last inch of coffee into an untouched mug, then set the carafe down with care. "You did not have all the information," he replied. "That is different." Grant hesitated, searching the older man's face for any trace of resentment. He found none. Only composure. Only quiet certainty. Across the room, Corporal Nate Holloway watched the exchange and felt something settle inside him. Legends, he realized, did not announce themselves. They simply stood where they were needed. Hayes closed his briefing folder with a firm but calm motion. This adjustment likely prevented a serious miscalculation, he said, addressing the room. "Let that be a reminder. Experience does not expire." His eyes moved again to Mercer. "Some of the best lessons do not come from rank." A faint murmur of agreement followed. Mercer shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. "The wind changes," he said. "You just have to feel when it does." Outside, the late afternoon sky had deepened to a muted blue, the American flag near the motor pool snapping once in a stronger gust before settling again. The sound carried faintly through the reinforced glass. Grant extended his hand. "If you are willing, sir, I would appreciate your input before we finalize the logistics package." Mercer looked at the offered hand for a moment, then clasped it firmly. The grip was strong, steady, unmistakably trained. "I am here every morning at 0700, he answered. "Coffee is on the house." A few quiet smiles appeared around the room. Not mocking. Respectful. Hayes allowed himself the smallest nod of approval. The projector dimmed as the updated route locked into place, green lines replacing red warnings. What had begun as a routine planning session had become something else entirely. Not a lecture. Not a reprimand. A reminder. Mercer lifted the empty tray and moved toward the door, footsteps unhurried. No one stopped him this time. No one dismissed him. As he reached the threshold, Hayes spoke once more, voice steady and clear. "Ghost line." Mercer paused briefly but did not turn. "Sir." Then he stepped into the hallway, the door closing softly behind him. Inside the strategy room, the officers returned to their work, but the atmosphere had changed. They were not just adjusting a map. They were recalibrating perspective. And somewhere down the corridor, an old Callsign had come back online, not to command attention, but to quietly raise the standard. The hallway outside the strategy room felt cooler, quieter, as if the walls themselves absorbed the weight of what had just happened. Samuel Mercer walked at an even pace, the stainless steel tray balanced against his palm, the faint scent of fresh coffee following him down the corridor. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long reflections across the polished tile floor. To anyone passing by, he was still just a contractor finishing his shift. Inside the briefing room, however, the ripple had not settled. Captain Lucas Grant stood by the screen long after the others resumed their seats. The updated route glowed in calm green lines, a subtle but undeniable correction. He replayed the moment in his mind, the steady voice pointing out the flaw, the quiet confidence that had required no rank to validate it. General William Hayes gathered his folder but did not leave immediately. "You learned something today, Captain," he said without accusation. Grant nodded once. Yes, sir. Hayes studied him carefully. Humility is not weakness. It is awareness. Grant exhaled slowly. I thought I had accounted for every variable. Hayes allowed himself a faint, knowing look. You accounted for data? He accounted for experience. Down the hall, Mercer paused beside a window overlooking the motor pool. The late sun cast a golden wash across rows of vehicles lined with mechanical precision. A gust of wind lifted dust in a brief spiral before it settled again. He watched it without expression, the way he had once watched ridgelines and weather patterns shift miles away. Footsteps approached behind him. Corporal Nate Holloway slowed as he drew near. Sir, Holloway said carefully. Mercer turned slightly. Corporal. Holloway hesitated, unsure of the boundary between contractor and legend. I just wanted to say, it was an honor to see that. Mercer regarded him for a long moment. Seeing is easy, he replied. Understanding takes time. Holloway nodded, absorbing the weight of the words. Will you be back tomorrow? Mercer gave the smallest hint of a smile. I am here every weekday at 0700. The coffee does not pour itself. Holloway managed a quiet laugh, then straightened instinctively. Yes, sir. Mercer did not correct him. He simply resumed walking. Back in the strategy room, the officers finalized their adjustments with renewed discipline. Conversations were shorter, sharper, less certain of their own perfection. Grant closed his laptop and looked once more at the doorway Mercer had exited through. He realized something uncomfortable and liberating at the same time. Authority could command a room. Experience could steady it. Hayes stepped toward the exit, pausing beside Grant. Remember this, the general said. Some of the most important voices you will ever hear will not be the loudest. Grant nodded. Understood, sir. Hayes left without another word, the soft click of the door echoing faintly. Outside, Mercer placed the empty tray onto a service cart and began rinsing the carafe at a small utility sink. The water ran. Clear, steady, unremarkable. A young private walked past without a second glance. Mercer did not mind. He had never needed recognition to define him. Somewhere inside the building, maps were being redrawn because he had chosen to speak. And somewhere deeper still, an old Callsign rested quietly again, not erased, not forgotten, simply waiting in silence as it always had. The next morning arrived with a sharp, early chill that settled over Fort Ridgeline like a quiet inspection. At 0645, the corridor lights hummed to life one by one, casting pale reflections across the polished floors. Samuel Mercer was already there. The stainless steel carafe steamed gently on the service cart, the scent of fresh coffee drifting through the hallway long before the first officer stepped inside. He moved with the same measured rhythm as always, aligning cups, straightening napkins, wiping a single invisible ring from the edge of the oak conference table. Nothing about him demanded attention. Everything about him commanded it. At 0658, Captain Lucas Grant entered the strategy room alone. He paused when he saw Mercer adjusting the projector angle by less than an inch so the image would fall perfectly centered. Good morning, Grant said, voice steady. Mercer nodded once. Morning, Captain. There was no edge in the title now. Only respect. Grant set his folder down and glanced at the updated route map, still glowing faintly on the screen from the night before. I reviewed the numbers again, he said. Your adjustment reduces projected exposure by 38%. Mercer gave a small shrug. Wind rarely cooperates with projections. The door opened again. Corporal Nate Holloway stepped in, then two lieutenants, then a major. They greeted Mercer quietly, each with a nod that lingered half a second longer than it would have 24 hours earlier. The room filled not with chatter, but with intention. At 0700 exactly, General William Hayes entered. No dramatic pause. No raised voice. He took his seat and looked around the table. Let us begin. The briefing unfolded differently now. When Grant presented the revised logistics plan, he did not rush. He acknowledged the previous oversight without defensiveness. We recalibrated based on environmental drift at elevation, he explained. Hayes listened, then shifted his gaze briefly toward the coffee station. Mercer stood there as he had the day before, hands folded lightly in front of him. Eyes attentive but distant, as if he were listening for something beyond the room. Does anyone see a vulnerability we have missed? Hayes asked. Silence followed, but it was thoughtful silence, not complacent. One lieutenant hesitated, then spoke up with a minor adjustment suggestion. Grant nodded immediately. Good catch. The tone had changed. The culture had shifted. Mercer poured a fresh cup and set it near the edge of the table beside Grant without interrupting the flow. Grant glanced up. Thank you, sir. Mercer met his eyes briefly. Keep the line clear. The words carried more than instruction. They carried history. Outside, the morning wind moved across the base again, lifting the flag in a firm, steady wave. Inside, the map displayed clean green routes, each one refined not just by technology, but by memory. Hayes closed the session with a simple statement. Competence earns respect. Humility keeps it. Chairs slid back in controlled motion. Officers gathered their folders and exited with quiet purpose. Mercer began collecting the empty cups, stacking them carefully on his tray. As he turned toward the door, Holloway stopped him. Sir, will you ever tell the full story? Mercer considered the question for a long moment. The mission was never about the story, he replied. It was about the line staying open. Holloway nodded slowly. Mercer stepped into the hallway once more, blending into the rhythm of the base as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Behind him, plans moved forward with greater precision, guided not by pride, but by perspective. Some men lead from the front. Some lead from behind a call sign spoken only once. And sometimes, the strongest signal in the room is the one that barely raises its voice. By the end of the week, the shift was no longer subtle. It moved through Fort Ridgeline like a quiet current, unseen but unmistakable. Officers who once walked past the service cart without a glance now paused, offering a nod, a steady, "Good morning, sir," spoken without irony. Samuel Mercer never corrected them. He never encouraged it either. He simply poured the coffee the same way he always had, steady hand, measured rhythm, eyes that seemed to read more than the room in front of him. Captain Lucas Grant found himself arriving earlier each day, not out of obligation, but intention. On Friday morning, he stepped into the strategy room at 0640 and found Mercer already standing near the window, watching the sunrise spill gold across the motor pool. The vehicles were lined in perfect formation, their silhouettes sharp against the pale sky. You ever miss it? Grant asked quietly. Mercer did not turn immediately. The uniform? He asked. Grant nodded. The weight of it. Mercer considered the question as if it deserved more than a quick answer. The uniform was never the weight, he said at last. Responsibility was. Grant absorbed that in silence. He had worn the uniform for over a decade, but he was only beginning to understand what that meant. Inside the room, the updated operational plan rested finalized and signed. Adjustments had been made, redundancies built in, vulnerabilities reduced. Not because of technology alone, but because someone had been willing to speak without ego and someone else had been willing to listen. The door opened at 07 sharp. General William Hayes entered, his presence steady as always. He did not address Mercer this time. He did not need to. The respect had already been established. The briefing moved efficiently, voices controlled, analysis sharpened by humility. When Grant finished outlining the final timeline, Hayes gave a single approving nod. Execute with discipline, he said. And remember what recalibrated this room. His gaze passed briefly over Mercer before returning to the officers. After the meeting adjourned, Holloway lingered near the coffee station. Sir, he said to Mercer, I told my brother about what happened. Mercer raised an eyebrow slightly. You should not exaggerate, he replied. Holloway shook his head. I did not have to. Mercer allowed the faintest smile. Then you told it correctly. Outside, the wind lifted again, brushing across the base with a low, steady sweep. The flag moved in a firm arc, not violent, not weak. Balanced. Mercer gathered the empty cups and placed them onto the tray. Grant stepped forward one last time before Mercer left the room. If there is ever a way we can honor what you did, Grant began, searching for the right words. Mercer stopped him gently with a look. You already did, he said. You listened. Grant straightened unconsciously. The statement carried more weight than any medal ceremony ever could. Mercer pushed the cart toward the hallway, the wheels rolling smoothly over tile. He did not look back. Inside the strategy room, young officers stood a little taller, spoke a little more carefully, and checked their assumptions twice. The mission would move forward as planned, strengthened not by pride, but by perspective. And somewhere within the quiet rhythm of the base, a lesson settled in permanent ink. Respect is not given. It is recognized. The operation launched under a pale gray sky that seemed undecided about whether it would clear or harden into storm. At 0530, engines rolled to life across Fort Ridgeline in disciplined sequence, headlights cutting clean lines through the morning mist. Inside the command center, the revised route glowed steady on the central display. Green corridors moving west 3 miles before angling north behind the elevation break Samuel Mercer had pointed out days earlier. Captain Lucas Grant stood at the main console, headset secure, posture firm but no longer rigid with pride. All units confirmed drift adjustment, he said calmly. Voices responded one by one, measured and professional. There was no rush in the room, only coordination. General William Hayes observed from behind, arms folded lightly, eyes scanning both the screen and the people operating it. Corporal Nate Holloway monitored environmental data, wind speed fluctuating between 18 and 22 miles per hour at elevation, exactly the kind of variable that could have gone unnoticed before. Wind shear increasing along the original route, Holloway reported. Grant nodded. Maintain revised corridor. On the large display, a secondary overlay showed what would have occurred under the previous projection. The margin narrowed significantly near the northern ridge, exposure windows tightening in a way that made the room collectively aware of how close the oversight had been. Hayes spoke without raising his voice. The difference between assumption and awareness is often measured in seconds. Grant kept his focus forward. And in miles, sir. Outside, the convoy advanced precisely along the adjusted path. Satellite feeds confirmed clear passage behind the natural elevation break Mercer had described. The ridge that once appeared harmless now showed its full effect in the data stream, wind currents colliding unpredictably along its edge. Holloway glanced briefly toward the doorway of the command center, half expecting to see Mercer standing there with a quiet nod. Instead, the old contractor was likely somewhere down the corridor, rinsing cups, aligning trays, unaware that the line he had helped secure was holding exactly as predicted. Inside the control room, tension eased incrementally as each checkpoint cleared. Support staging. Confirmed, a voice reported through the speakers. No deviation. Grant allowed himself a measured breath. Not relief. Confirmation. Hayes stepped forward slightly. Captain. Grant turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. Yes, sir. You adjusted when it mattered. Grant understood what that meant. Not just the route, the room, the perspective. Hours later, as final confirmations came in and the operation concluded without complication, the command center settled into a quiet hum of satisfied professionalism. No cheers, no dramatics, just steady competence. Grant removed his headset and looked once more at the glowing green lines. Sometimes the strongest signal is the one you almost ignored, he said softly. Hayes gave a faint nod. And sometimes it comes from a man holding a coffee pot. The room allowed a small, respectful smile. Outside, the wind shifted again, but the line held. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of Fort Ridgeline, Samuel Mercer continued his work, never announcing what he had safeguarded, never asking to be remembered. Some legends do not need the spotlight. They simply ensure the mission moves forward. The official confirmation arrived just after 1400 hours, transmitted in a steady, composed voice across the secure line. All units had completed their objectives and returned without complication. No deviation, no last-minute recalculations, no emergency reroutes. Inside the command center at Fort Ridgeline, the atmosphere shifted from focused intensity to disciplined satisfaction. Captain Lucas Grant removed his headset slowly, setting it down with deliberate care. The green corridors still glowed across the central display, the adjusted path now recorded as the executed route. Corporal Nate Holloway leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose, as if releasing tension he had not realized he was carrying. Wind shear peaked at 24 miles per hour along the original projection, he said quietly. It would have tightened the margin by half. Grant nodded once, but not along the revised line. General William Hayes stepped forward, hands resting lightly behind his back. The mission held because the line was recalibrated before it mattered, he said. His voice carried neither celebration nor reprimand, only truth. He looked around the room at the officers who had once been certain they had accounted for every variable. We do not measure strength by how loudly we lead, Hayes continued. We measure it by how well we listen. The officers absorbed that in silence. The data on the screen slowly minimized, replaced by a finalized operational summary stamped complete. Outside, late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the base, stretching across concrete and steel in steady lines. Down the corridor, Samuel Mercer stood at the small utility sink, rinsing ceramic mugs beneath a clear stream of water. The sound was simple, ordinary. He dried each cup with a clean cloth and placed it carefully onto the rack. A young private stepped in to refill the sugar container and paused awkwardly. "Sir," the private said, unsure whether the title fit. Mercer glanced up. "Yes." The private hesitated. "They said the route worked exactly like you predicted." Mercer returned to drying the cup, movements unhurried. "It worked because they adjusted," he replied. "Prediction is not the point. Adaptation is." The private nodded, even if he did not fully understand. Back in the command center, Grant stepped away from the display and walked toward the hallway. He found Mercer near the service card, aligning the lids on the coffee containers with precise attention. "It held," Grant said simply. Mercer met his gaze. "Good." There was no triumph in his tone, only acknowledgement. Grant extended his hand again, not as apology this time, but as respect between professionals. Mercer clasped it firmly. "You kept the line clear," Mercer said. Grant allowed himself a faint, grateful smile. "We did." Mercer released the handshake and began pushing the cart down the corridor, wheels rolling softly against the tile. No one stopped him. No one questioned him. The respect did not need to be spoken again. Inside the base, the mission would be logged as a successful execution supported by refined environmental analysis. The official report would mention wind patterns, elevation breaks, and timing adjustments. It would not mention the quiet contractor who saw what others missed. It did not need to. Some signals are strongest when they are not broadcast. And sometimes the man holding the coffee pot is the one who ensures the mission moves forward without ever raising his voice. That evening, Fort Ridgeline settled into its familiar rhythm. Engines cooling in the motor pool, boots echoing faintly along concrete corridors, the American flag lowering in a measured, deliberate descent as the sun dipped below the horizon. Inside the strategy wing, the command center lights dimmed one row at a time. Captain Lucas Grant remained at his desk longer than usual, the finalized report open on his screen. The document detailed wind speeds, elevation adjustments, recalculated margins, and refined staging positions measured down to the mile. It was precise, professional, complete, yet something about it felt unfinished. General William Hayes stepped in quietly, jacket folded over his arm. "Still reviewing?" he asked. Grant nodded. "Yes, sir. I wanted to ensure the environmental analysis was properly credited." Hayes regarded him carefully. "Credited to whom?" Grant hesitated. The official report template did not have a line for quiet contractors. It did not have a section labeled instinct or experience. "To the source of the recalibration," Grant answered at last. Hayes gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "Then word it correctly." Grant turned back to the screen and typed a new line beneath the operational summary. Environmental correction based on senior advisory input regarding terrain wind behavior. It was subtle. It did not name Samuel Mercer, but it acknowledged that the correction had not come from software alone. Hayes observed the addition, then placed a firm hand on Grant's shoulder. "Leadership is not about claiming the signal," he said. "It is about protecting it." Down the corridor, Mercer locked the small supply cabinet and placed the keys into his pocket. The hallway was nearly empty now, fluorescent lights casting long reflections across the floor. He moved at the same steady pace as always, pushing the cart toward the service entrance. As he passed the large window overlooking the base, he paused briefly. Night had settled fully, a clear sky revealing a scatter of stars above the quiet outline of vehicles and hangars. For a moment, the reflection in the glass showed not just a gray-haired contractor, but the faint outline of a younger man standing on a distant ridgeline, radio pressed close, listening for wind shifts across miles of open terrain. The memory did not linger. It did not need to. Footsteps approached from behind. Grant stopped a few feet away, hands at his sides. "Sir," he said. Mercer turned slightly. "Captain." Grant held his posture straight. No hesitation this time. "The report reflects the adjustment," he said. Mercer studied him for a brief moment, then nodded once. "Good." Silence settled between them, not awkward, not heavy. Respectful. Grant finally spoke again. You could have taken credit. Mercer's eyes returned to the darkened base beyond the glass. Credit does not hold the line, he replied. Competence does. Grant absorbed the words fully this time. Mercer resumed, pushing the cart, wheels rolling softly toward the exit. The door closed behind him with a muted click. Inside Fort Ridgeline, operations would continue, missions would launch, routes would be drawn and redrawn. But something fundamental had shifted in that building. Assumptions would be questioned. Voices would be weighed differently. And somewhere within the quiet hum of the base, an old call sign rested once more, not seeking recognition, only ensuring that when the wind changed, someone would be ready to listen. Monday arrived with a thin layer of frost along the edges of the motor pool, the kind that turned steel surfaces pale under early morning light. Fort Ridgeline moved with its usual discipline, but the undercurrent had changed. In the strategy wing, officers gathered a few minutes earlier than required, reviewing environmental reports with sharper attention than before. Captain Lucas Grant stood near the window, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, watching as wind data updated across the display in steady intervals. 20 miles per hour at elevation. Slight drift toward the northwest. He did not wait for someone else to notice it. Let us verify the secondary approach again, he said calmly. No one questioned the suggestion. Across the room, Corporal Nate Holloway adjusted the overlay and nodded. Good call. The projector hummed softly as revised margins appeared. General William Hayes entered without announcement, observing the quiet recalibration in progress. He did not interrupt. He did not need to. The lesson had rooted itself. Down the corridor, Samuel Mercer unlocked the service cabinet at 0645, setting out ceramic mugs in careful rows. The steam rising from the carafe curled upward in thin, deliberate spirals. A junior lieutenant stepped in hesitantly, holding a printed weather chart. Sir, he said, then corrected himself. Mr. Mercer. Mercer glanced up, faint amusement in his eyes. Lieutenant. The young officer placed the chart on the counter. Would you look at this? Mercer studied the lines, fingertips resting lightly on the paper. Pressure is dropping faster than predicted, he said after a moment. You may want to stage support 10 minutes earlier. The lieutenant nodded, absorbing the suggestion without defensiveness. Thank you. Mercer handed the chart back as if it were nothing more than routine. Inside the strategy room, Grant adjusted the timeline accordingly. Before Hayes even spoke, the general noticed. You are listening before you are told, Hayes observed. Grant allowed a small, steady smile. Trying to, sir. Hayes stepped closer to the screen, watching the updated sequence settle into place. Leadership is rarely about having the loudest voice, he said. It is about recognizing the right one. The operation that week was smaller, routine by comparison, but the preparation carried the same discipline. Every assumption was tested. Every route double-checked. Outside, the wind shifted again, brushing frost from the edges of parked vehicles. The flag lifted in a steady wave as morning brightened. Mercer finished aligning the cups and wheeled the cart toward the hallway, passing by the open strategy room door. He did not step inside. He did not need to. Grant caught sight of him and gave a quiet nod. Mercer returned at once, then continued down the corridor. The base would continue to operate long after his shift ended, missions unfolding across miles of terrain measured in data and instinct. But something permanent had settled into the culture of that building. Experience would not be dismissed as outdated. Silence would not be mistaken for insignificance. And when the wind changed at 6,000 feet or at ground level, someone would pause long enough to feel it. In the quiet rhythm of Fort Ridgeline, the strongest signal was no longer the loudest command. It was the steady voice that kept the line open, even when no one thought to ask. Late autumn settled deeper over Fort Ridgeline, the air carrying that sharp, metallic edge that came before winter fully claimed the ground. Frost clung longer to the pavement in the mornings, and breath showed faintly in the early light. Inside the strategy wing, the rhythm remained steady but more deliberate than it had been weeks earlier. Environmental briefings now began with a question instead of a declaration. What are we not seeing? Captain Lucas Grant would ask before every session, eyes scanning the room not for confirmation, but for contradiction. It was a subtle shift, but it changed everything. One morning, as wind advisories rolled in from a neighboring sector, Corporal Nate Holloway hesitated before speaking. The data projected stable conditions, yet something about the pressure drop felt off. "It is minor," he began, unsure. Grant did not dismiss it. "Minor is where we start," he replied. "Walk us through it." The projector hummed softly as Holloway expanded the overlay. A slight temperature inversion at elevation. A narrow band that could compress timing by minutes. Not dramatic. Not catastrophic. But enough. General William Hayes watched the exchange without interruption, a faint approval in his steady gaze. Adjust 10 minutes earlier, Grant decided. No debate. No ego. Just awareness. Down the corridor, Samuel Mercer was aligning fresh cups in neat rows, the steam rising in thin curls toward the fluorescent lights. A young specialist approached with quiet urgency. "Mr. Mercer, have you noticed the wind pattern this week?" Mercer paused, eyes thoughtful. "It lingers longer in the late afternoon," he said. "Cold air sinks faster than you expect this time of year." The specialist nodded slowly, committing the observation to memory. Mercer did not elaborate. He never did. Inside the strategy room, the revised schedule locked into place. Hayes finally spoke, voice calm but firm. "Competence is built on information. Wisdom is built on attention." His gaze drifted briefly toward the hallway, as if aware that the source of both was only a few yards away, unseen but present. The operation that afternoon unfolded with quiet precision. Minor timing adjustments prevented overlap. Support units staged exactly where they needed to be. The margin held steady. When confirmation came through, it carried no fanfare. Just a simple, clear acknowledgement. Grant removed his headset and allowed himself a small breath. He did not look relieved. He looked steady. After the debrief, he stepped into the corridor and found Mercer near the service cart. "We adjusted again," Grant said. Mercer nodded once. "You are learning to feel it." Grant studied him carefully. "It is not just the data, is it?" Mercer offered the faintest hint of a smile. "Data speaks," he replied, "but experience listens." Outside, the wind brushed along the base in a low, steady sweep, rattling a distant flag halyard against metal. The sound echoed briefly, then settled. Mercer pushed the cart forward, disappearing down the hallway with the same quiet composure he had always carried. Inside Fort Ridgeline, assumptions no longer went unchecked. Voices were weighed differently. And in the space between projection and reality, someone always paused long enough to listen for the shift. The line remained open, not because it was commanded to, but because it understood. Winter finally settled in without ceremony, covering Fort Ridgeline in. A thin, even layer of frost that softened the hard edges of steel and concrete. The motor pool looked quieter beneath the pale morning light. Vehicles lined in disciplined rows as if waiting for inspection. Inside the strategy wing, the air carried the faint scent of fresh coffee and cold air drifting in whenever the outer door opened. Captain Lucas Grant stood at the head of the table, reviewing a new operational outline. He no longer rushed through the first slide. Instead, he paused before speaking, eyes scanning the faces around him. "Before we begin," he said calmly, "what are we missing?" The question had become tradition. Officers leaned forward, not to defend their projections, but to test them. Corporal Nate Holloway adjusted the wind overlay, checking elevation drift twice before nodding. A lieutenant cross-referenced staging times without being prompted. General William Hayes observed from the far end of the room, hands folded behind his back, expression steady. He did not need to correct anyone. The culture had corrected itself. Down the corridor, Samuel Mercer finished arranging the final row of ceramic mugs, aligning them with quiet precision. Steam rose in gentle spirals from the stainless steel carafe, catching the light in faint silver ribbons. A young specialist approached, holding a weather tablet. "Mr. Mercer, the forecast shows stable conditions," he said, almost apologetically. Mercer studied the screen for a moment. "Stable does not mean constant," he replied. "Check again at elevation." The specialist nodded, absorbing the lesson without embarrassment. Inside the strategy room, the briefing unfolded with clarity and discipline. Minor adjustments were made before they became major ones. Timelines shifted by minutes that mattered. No one rolled their eyes. No one dismissed quiet observations. When the session concluded, Hayes addressed the room in a voice that carried calm authority. "Readiness is not just preparation," he said. "It is perspective." His gaze lingered briefly toward the open doorway, where Mercer's silhouette passed in steady motion. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the frost in soft gold, Grant stepped into the hallway and found Mercer preparing to leave. The cart was empty, cups cleaned, surfaces wiped down to a dull shine. "Sir," Grant said, the word no longer tentative. Mercer turned slightly. "Captain." Grant held his posture straight. "The room feels different now." Mercer nodded once. "It listens." Grant allowed a faint smile. "Because of you." Mercer shook his head gently. "Because you chose to." The statement settled deeper than any formal commendation ever could. Outside, the wind moved across the base in a long, steady sweep, lifting the flag into a firm arc against the winter sky. Mercer stepped toward the exit, pushing the cart with the same measured pace he had carried from the beginning. No spotlight followed him. No announcement marked his departure. Inside Fort Ridgeline, maps would continue to glow, engines would continue to start before dawn, and officers would continue to recalibrate before committing to a line. But something enduring had taken root in that building. Experience would never again be mistaken for irrelevance. Silence would never again be confused with insignificance. And somewhere in the quiet space between data and decision, an old call sign remained understood without needing to be spoken. Some legends do not raise their voices. They raise the standard.